Hello, my name is Doug Smith, and this is the 13 January 2017 edition of Portsmouth This Week, the voice of Portsmouth Town Hall. This is our first program for the year 2017, and our guest today is our own director of the program, Rich Talipsky, who's also the Portsmouth Director of Business Development. Welcome to the show, Rich.
Good to be here, Doug.
Before we get started on the job and what it entails and what's going on with business development, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own background.
Sure. I was brought up in eastern Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. I got a master's degree of electrical engineering from the University of Louisville and a master of national security and strategy from the Naval War College. I spent 30 years in the Navy, served on 5 submarines, commanded 2 nuclear submarines. And then I spent 3 years on the staff of the 6th Fleet Commander in Gaeta, Italy, as the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations during Desert Storm 1. And then I went to the Pentagon and I was on the Secretary of Defense's staff as the Senior Military Officer for the Department of Defense Inspector General and as Chief of Joint Operations. And then I retired from the Navy in '97. And I went out to work for the private sector at a company in Alexandria, Virginia, who sent me up here to Rhode Island in about 1989. And the last 10 years, I've worked as the Vice President for Corporate and Business Development for C Corp, a defense contractor in Middletown. I also serve on the Newport County Chamber of Commerce Board, the board of the PBA, the Portsmouth Business Association, the board of the Southeastern New England Defense Industry Alliance, which is the prime defense industry organization, and I also was on the Economic Development Committee for 10 years, and was the chairman of the Portsmouth Economic Development Committee from 2005 to 2007. And of course, normally I'm in the control room, but now I'm out in front of the camera.
That's right. So. Well, it sounds like you had a very a great military career, and I'd like to thank you for your service before we get started. Why was the position of the Director of Business Development formed in Portsmouth?
Well, back in about 2001, when we were on the Economic Development Committee, we were looking at the value of businesses in Portsmouth. And we figured out we needed an advocate for businesses, not only existing businesses, but to attract new businesses. So the Economic Development Committee recommended to the Town Council the establishment of a full-time Business Development Director position. They approved a part-time position, which was filled by Bill Clark, who was my predecessor in this job.
So what exactly is the job of the...
Well, like I said, I'm the advocate for businesses. For existing businesses, you know, if they want to expand or they have some issues on the town ordinances and codes, I kind of maneuver them around the town hall to get those things done. For new businesses that come in, I kind of get them started on what they need to do to start a new business, point them in the right direction in town hall, introduce them to people, and kind of help them along the way.
So that would include the permitting process and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it does. We'll talk a little bit about that later, I think, but the permitting and licensing process is an important part of that.
Yeah. How can people contact you?
Well, you can put up my contact information. My phone is 643-0382, and my email is rtalipsky@portsmouthri.com. I'm committed to 50 hours a month, but I'm normally in the office Monday through Friday, just about the whole day, so people can stop to the second floor of the town hall and just come in and talk with me.
Okay, so anybody's got questions about that or about spaces for rent or things like that, they can come up.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, we have a new thing on the website that is directly linked to Rhode Island Living, that they automatically update our website with new commercial properties that are available.
Okay, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about the tax base and why businesses are so important to the tax base.
Okay, well, back in about 2009, the PEDC looked at a study on what the town revenues were required. And if you can put us on this. We took a look at the town revenues historically from 1990 on. And then we took a look at what the projected budget of the town would be in the out years. Now there's a couple interesting points on this graph. One was this law that was passed in 2005, which is the 3050 legislation of 2005, also called the PIVA weed law. What that did was that limited the maximum amount of property tax increase in a year to 4%. So that would limit the amount of property taxes, which is this blue area, that you could charge in the out years. Also, during the Carcieri administration, he had a plan to reduce the amount of state and federal revenue that came back to towns. So we knew that was going to decrease. So we took a look at that, and then we took a look at the increase in town budget historically, and then we took a look at this, what we call the gap, which is additional revenues that are required to do things for the town. And this orange line is what we need for additional revenues, which turned out to be transfer station permit, things like that. Then this red line were things that we kind of deferred, like paving of roads and things like that. So this is the key graph in trying to figure out how you fill this gap, knowing that your property taxes are going to be limited. Now, people get kind of fixed on the tax rates. It really isn't a tax rate, because if you look at the tax rates here over the history, they go all over the place. Like in the 1950s here, the tax rate was over $40 per thousand, but now it's down here right now. So it isn't really the tax rate. So I like to look at it a little bit more about how it comes out of the pocketbook of a residence. And this is comparing all the Rhode Island communities, and this is a family that has a $350,000 house and two $20,000 autos. I just kind of picked that. So you can look that in Portsmouth, their tax bill is a little over $6,000. But if you look at all the other municipalities, we go right about in the middle of that, a little bit better than average. So we're not too bad. We're not as good as some other communities, but we're not as bad as living in some other communities in Rhode Island. So we have about a little over $3 billion of assessed value of personal property and commercial property in Portsmouth, and that's what this looks like. And every time we have a revaluation, then that changes based on what the assessments are. Now, if you look at these three values, there's a red graph, which is property taxes of our year-round residents. Then we have this green box, which we call recreational residential, I'll talk about in a minute. And then this blue box, which is commercial taxpayers. Now, commercial taxpayers are normal businesses. Industrial, we don't have a lot of industrial property. Raytheon is about the only place we have industrial property. Utilities, people don't understand that the electric company owns our telephone poles, the water company owns their water sources, they pay taxes on that. So that's utilities. And tangibles are the property that is owned by businesses. So that's what goes into all this thing called commercial. Now, those particular entities use or provide tax revenue to us. And there have been several studies that take a look at how much those particular entities provide to the town. So if you look at businesses who don't have an average of 2.5 students in school, don't command a lot of town services, for every tax dollar they pay, they only use about 37 cents of that tax dollar, and they return to the town 73 cents every time they give a dollar of taxes. On open space, privately owned open space, that's about 61 cents. And if you look at residences here, they consume $1.16 for every tax dollar that they put in. So they're what we call revenue negatives. And this graph shows that for every 14 houses you build, you have to bring in one large company to offset that loss. Okay. Now, back when we were kind of analyzing this tax base and what would be revenue positive and revenue negative, we took a look at the residents that weren't here year-round. We took the looks particularly at the Carnegie development. We found out that those people that are taxpayers stay here 4 months out of the year. They don't have students in school. So they are not really these people that command $1.16. We did an analysis, and the way we figured out those properties is we looked at the properties who pay taxes using an address that is not Portsmouth. Then we look at the voter rolls, and if there's no voter at that address, that means that's somebody who doesn't stay here all year round. So that's what we did with this. And we figured that they return about 57 cents on every tax dollar they pay.
Yeah,
so the Carnegie development That big tower that
Yeah.
pays $1 million in taxes, and all those large properties around there really add a lot to our tax
Yeah,
base.
it's very beneficial. I can see that.
So we did a graph of this from 1990 on, and back in 1990, our commercial tax base was about 17% of our total tax base. Now, as we started to turn farms into residences, that eroded down to the early 2000s. We were down to our commercial tax base only being about 10.5% from that 17% in 2090. And these little glitches in here are revaluation years. But that business base kind of has stayed constant, but that's one of the reasons for the business development director, to make sure this thing doesn't
Drop off the edge
continue
of
on
the
like
cliff.
this. Back in 2010, we decided to include these recreational residential properties, because that's what we call revenue positive. So when adding to that, and this year we're up to about 17.5%. So we're back about where we were back in the old days of lots of farms. So looking at a percent of the tax base, this is the entire tax base, you can see that this percentage of these, what we call revenue positive things, are getting larger and larger, which has made this red line go down, which means the property tax burden on our property tax owners has gone down. If you look at it in a little more simplistic way, this is the graph of, on top is revenue positive taxpayers and revenue negative taxpayers. So you can see as these graphs go up, this burden on our year-round taxpayers actually goes down. So we try to do a projection and see, well, what's going to happen in the future? So we think that the commercial tax base is going to stay about the same. It's important that it doesn't go down. We don't lose a lot of good businesses. But then we think there are going to be a lot of communities that are going to have people that don't have students in the schools. They're planned communities that do their own services and things. So we think that that's in the future. The town is helping out the taxpayer in the future. So that's our kind of our prediction.
Okay, so the future looks good, but I guess the bottom line, even with taxes from businesses and recreational residential units, there's still a gap in what we're spending and what we're making, what we're bringing in.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where that gap is, and we have to figure out how we fill that gap, and there's only several ways to do that. If you look at the town budget, there's not a lot of what we call discretionary. That means things that we can manipulate, because there's a lot of things like labor laws, pensions, and things like that that consume a great deal of the budget that the town administrator cannot do anything about in the very short term. So in the short term, for every budget, we have a small amount of things like road maintenance, and the school budget is 62% of our total budget.
Yeah.
And even a small part of that, Anna Raleigh doesn't have a lot she could do with that as well. So what do you do? Well, I think you need to prioritize what you have in town. You got to look at things that are critical, things that are essential, things that are routine, and things that are not necessary. And you got to see if you can get rid of those things that are not necessary and figure out what's critical. People might think that police forces are critical. Well, a certain element in the police force is critical, but how much of that is essential? How big a police force do you need? How big a police station do you need? All those kinds of things the town administrator has to look at in not only a one-year budget, and one of the problems we have is we only have a one-year budget, but the town administrator has a 5-year plan that he updates every year, trying to figure out how to look at these things in the out years. And one of the things is our road maintenance program, where they just decided in our capital improvement plan to put $1 million a year into road maintenance, and our road maintenance has gone up significantly.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of years where we deferred maintenance on the roads, and everybody felt it. I mean, it was these are basically the arteries of your town.
That's right.
So I think it's very necessary.
Yeah. Another thing you can do is get things that induce actual positive revenue to the town. Now, what are those things? Well, the Melville Campground for years was a money-losing operation. So a couple of years ago, we made a deal with a private operator. He took over the concession of the Melville Campground, put a lot of money of his own money into there, and now it's a money-making operation. It's an enterprise for the town. The Glen Manor House is another revenue generator as an enterprise. We have a new agreement that we're formulating with the Glen Farm Stables. Glen Farm Stables used to be a money sump, deteriorating buildings, and now we have a company that's going to be a concessionaire that's actually going to give us revenue, fix up the Glen Farm Stables, and operate as a positive revenue source. So we need those positive revenue enterprises.
What about Newport Polo? And how do we get those fields on a...
That's a better subject for Tim, our recreation director, but there are a lot of people who compete for using those polo fields. It isn't just our local soccer teams. They have professional lacrosse teams and Newport Polo, and all those are governed by separate agreements with those people, and we have to make sure that the town gets their fair share to make sure that those are revenue positive for the town as well.
Yeah. I think the bottom line of all of this, though, after looking at your graphs, is that we need to attract more business. And I'm just wondering, what kind of incentives do we have to attract businesses here?
Okay, well, one of the incentives, if you compare us to some other towns, is we have the same tax rate for commercial entities as personal property. Some towns charge a higher tax rate for businesses, which is a negative incentive. We have two other programs. One is the state program called the Enterprise Zone. That's been in effect for about 10 years, and it's probably going to sunset in a couple years. And for about 80% of our town, which is designated as Enterprise Zone, we can provide tax incentives where if somebody brings in a new business to the town, that new infrastructure property tax is taxed over a 5-year period. The first year, they pay no tax. Next year, 80%, and it goes down until they pay entire tax in 5 years. Last year, we enacted legislation in the Assembly that has that same tax stabilization for the entire town, and it goes on for 10 years. The Assembly passed that for us. Same program. Some people say, well, why should you give businesses money? Because it costs all this tax money every year for 5 years. But if you look at a new business coming into town and staying here forever, or for a long time, that tax incentive money is paid back in about 7.5 years. So after about 7.5 years, that new business starts providing us revenue.
So how long then, you say it's been approved for another 10 years? Is that what you're looking at? Or?
Yeah, the law allowed us to enact this legislation for a 10-year period. Now, that is a Rhode Island general law that we have to turn into a town ordinance. So that'll be part of the town.
So that's something the town council will decide.
That's right. In fact, the difference in this legislation is that in the enterprise zone legislation, once the new development goes through the planning board, they just go to the tax assessor and he gives them the tax break. Under the new law, there's a specification that each of those have to come before the town council and justifies why they should get the tax breaks.
Yeah. As the Director of Business Development now, what is your relationship with the Economic Development Committee on?
Well, I serve as ex officio member of the Economic Development Committee. And in the past, that's kind of been an advisor. I'm trying to rejuvenate the Economic Development Committee, which really hasn't been that active in the past few years. And I'm trying to get them back up to step in developing a strategy, developing a program of work. We have a very good composition of the Economic Development Committee. We have a lawyer, we have a number of older businessmen, we have a number of realtors, but just recently we got 4 new members who are going to URI, 1 freshman, a sophomore, and 2 juniors who are, I call the young guns, and are bringing in a lot of new ideas and energy. Into
now, are they Portsmouth residents, or are they required to be, or anything like that?
There's no specific specification that PEDC members are Portsmouth residents, but all are.
The other question is, who is your council liaison with the EDC?
Okay, in the past, our council liaisons were Kevin Aguiar and Jim Seveny. Jim Seveny, of course, has gone to bigger and better things in the state Senate. and Linda Ujifusa has
great.
come on as that advisor, and Kevin Aguirre is going to stay on as an advisor.
Well, that's good. Those are all, and we expect big things from Jim too up there at the State House.
We hope
to
so.
Try to help us out. I served with you on the EDC back in the day. We're talking wind turbine and other things like that. But we did a lot of work on developing an economic strategy, having some kind of game plan. How has that evolved, or has it just dropped off the face of the earth?
Well, it really hasn't. You know, if we can look at these graphs, these are the actual graphs that came up with for our economic strategy that the Economic Development Committee developed in 2009. And the main part of this was doing a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis of our town. And if you can see some of these here, the strength was the tank farms. That's a great opportunity. The Marine Trade Center is an exceptional part of our economy. We know that we have a prime coastal location. It's an interesting fact that we have more coastline in Rhode Island than any other community in Rhode Island, and we will need to capitalize on that, but also protect it. We have to make sure that we, make sure we have these good. The Carnegie development is not bad. The Newport Beach Club is not bad. They're resort developments that don't command a lot of taxes, and that offsets us going to this thing called fee for services. I call that a cafeteria-style government.
Yeah.
I'm not an advocate of that, because I think even though I don't have children in school, I don't use the beach a lot, I think that all those things that my taxes go to kind of raise all the boats and make our community better than others. And recently in the paper it says our community is the most sought out for
A place to live.
So that's great.
I can vouch for that.
We have a lot of defense companies here. Island Park, we just had a lecture on Prudence Island at the library last night, but if you look at Island Park in the heyday of Island Park, that was a great place, a great revenue generator. We need to really rejuvenate that, change it into something, a better gem than it is. Looking at the weaknesses, way back when we talked about sewers as being the biggest weakness. I know that's a bad word to say, and we've debated that, but the fact remains that if we're going to develop something like the west side, we need to figure they need power, they need water, they need to take care of wastewater, however we do it. We're not going to be able to develop that area with companies coming in unless we can take care of that. Now, if you call it sewers or a local wastewater collection system, Carnegie Abbey has this
their own
system. You got to do something with that. So that's what that is. There's a lot of competing budgets, and I said we have to have this priority. We had a 3-hour seminar as part of our Economic Development Committee debate where we had 40 community members come in and talk about the budget, what was important. We have limited capital resources. Just like I said, that gap in the lowering revenues, it's not going to get much better. Transportation, 26,000 cars go over the Sakana River Bridge every day. Most of them just pass by, use our roads, and go to Newport. We want them to stop and spend some money in Newport and help us out. The whole development of the website is very, very important. And the town budget process. Right now we have a one-year town budget. Sometime we have to let the town administrator manage the budget and greater than a one-year budget. He has a 5-year plan, but we still have this one-year budget, and every year we wrestle with that. So there are a lot of things that went into that.
You've mentioned a couple times now West Side and the former Navy properties and stuff. From an outside perspective, not keeping too much track of this stuff, it seems like this thing is taking forever to happen. Is that still an opportunity, or is it just something?
Unfortunately, it's a government operation, but it's very complicated more than that. We hired a consultant, a national recognized consultant, to take a look at this transfer of property.
Yeah.
And it's not like transferring a piece of a baseball field off of West Main Road. It's taking a brown field that Navy has dumped things into for 100 years to try to figure out, well, how do you use that? There's a bunch of underground tanks. How do you do that? You know, what is the Navy's responsibility? What is the town's responsibility? The town doesn't want to buy a pig in a poke and have to
clean it up.
Clean it up. But there are a lot of checks and balances in the system, but it's very complicated.
You know, some of these priorities and some of these ideas of where the community should be going, isn't that kind of what the comprehensive plan is supposed to tell us?
Sure. Our town planner, Gary Crosby, is now working on the comprehensive community plan. And it goes in various elements. And all those elements are kind of governed by a state construct where they said, this is what your strategic community plan should look like. And we've gone through several, like infrastructure. We have an economic development part of that plan, which a lot of these things that we came up with in 2009, you'll see in the plan. So these things are still valid, and they're becoming part of that plan. The thing about the plan is that becomes law. That trumps the zoning ordinance, that trumps everything else. So once we approve that plan, and it's very important to make it right, it trumps everything else.
That's why I was very happy to see that the historic preservation element of the comprehensive plan is moving along too.
Right, there's a specific historic and cultural resources part of the plan. And when you think about Portsmouth, that is one of our biggest assets.
Absolutely.
Is our historic properties. And we don't have any historic districts like we don't have a historic district like Bristol. We have little gems of properties. We have the Glen and the Glen Manor House. So we need to figure out how to manage all those little things without having these historic districts that sometimes are easy, make it easier to get money.
Yeah. As the Director of Business Development, how do you relate to things like the other organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, like the Commerce RI, I think it's called now, the former RIEDC?
Well, of course, I serve on the board of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce, and I work very closely with them, and they're trying to come up with an economic development initiative that kind of covers all of Newport County and Bristol. I work very closely with Tom Ardito, the Executive Director of AIPC. We have a representative on AIPC, that's Keith Humphreys, who just came aboard. And as a matter of fact, Linda Ujifusa is also the town council liaison for the AIPC. Commerce RI has kind of evolved from what used to be the Commerce Corporation of Rhode Island, which used to give us a state rep that used to work with us, and now they've restructured. But I've developed a lot of contacts with Commerce RI, and I work very closely with them.
Yeah, that's great. We're almost out of time, Rich, but I'd like to kind of close on a personal note. I know you are deeply involved in volunteering in addition to your actual job here. You volunteer, you're a member of the board of the Historical Society, you're part of the Emergency Operations Center team, as well as producing and directing this program, and I'd like to thank you for all your volunteer service. I guess my last question would be, how do you give advice to people who would think about volunteering?
I want them to get involved. You know, PEDC meets every third Wednesday of the month at 7 o'clock. Come and learn about that. Go to town council meetings, watch the town council meetings on TV, and get involved.
Okay, great advice. Rich, thanks very much for being aboard.
Appreciate being here.
And we'll see you next time.